بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. Last week we spoke about the great Palestinian revolt that took place between 1936 and 1939. And we spoke about how towards the end of that revolt in 1939, the British were able to quell it by making false promises once again to the Palestinians about giving them a unified state and giving them independence and rule over their own state and restricting Jewish immigration. The British, they made all of these promises to the Palestinians, and because of this, the Palestinian revolt was quelled. They calmed down. The Palestinians, they believed these promises from the British, and because of this, they slowed down the revolution, and they basically ended the revolution. That was in the year 1939. It was in August of 1939 that this great Palestinian revolt ended. Just a few days after the end of the Palestinian revolt, in September of that same year, September of 1939, the whole world was shaken when Germany, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, initiated World War II by invading Poland. So Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, they began to go country by country in Europe, invading countries, occupying countries, and the European nations started to collapse before the Nazis. Denmark fell, Norway fell, and several other countries fell. Even France fell. The Germans, they were able to occupy Paris. And Britain was in great danger as well. The British feared that the Germans would eventually come for them as well. So Britain called on the nations of the world asking for support. And while this was happening, the Germans were bombing London from the air. And they also targeted British military forces in other countries in Europe, and also British military forces within England itself were being targeted by the Germans, right? So this is a big deal. So now there are two sides here. There's the German side and there is the British side. So who is going to ally with the Germans and who is going to ally with the British? Italy announced its alliance with the Germans. So Mussolini, who was the leader of Italy at that time, he joined Hitler. And he sided with the Germans. As for Russia, they announced that they were going to side with the British, with the English. So those who sided with the British, they were known as the Allied forces, and those who sided with Germany, they were known as the Axis, right? So this was becoming a huge world war with international involvement, right? So the world was really on fire. Then Japan entered the war, and they sided with the Axis. They sided with Germany. And after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in 1941, then America also entered the war against the Axis. So America entered on the side of the Allies against the Germans and of course against the Japanese. So the world was engulfed in a massive, huge war that spread across the globe. And when all was said and done, 25 million people died in World War II. Can you imagine that? 25 million people died in World War II. Humanity had never experienced anything like this, right? It was something that the people had not seen before. So now, the British, during World War II, they wanted to focus on saving themselves from the Germans, right? So they didn't want to deal with all of the issues in Palestine at this time. That became a secondary issue for them. So they wanted to de-escalate the conflict in Palestine, and they wanted to calm down the Arabs because they had bigger fish to fry. They had more important things on their plate, right? Saving themselves. So they didn't want they didn't want the Arabs to start another revolt at this time, especially, right? Because they were too busy trying to save their own nation. So they wanted to basically de-escalate their conflict with the Arabs in Palestine, and they wanted to calm the Arabs down. So those Jews that were fleeing from Europe under the German Nazi pressure, as the Germans were taking over countries in Europe and they were persecuting the Jews, those Jews were trying to flee from those lands. So the British, they wanted to relocate those Jews, but they didn't want to relocate them in Palestine at this time, because they feared by taking these Jews and relocating them in Palestine, that's going to make the Arabs mad, and then the Arabs are going to revolt again, and the British, they didn't want to deal with another Arab revolt at this time. So they started relocating Jews, the British started relocating Jews to other places. They were relocating them to Mauritius, to Trinidad, right? They were relocating them to other places. So this is something that the Zionists were very angry with. That why are the British relocating Jews into these different lands? Why don't they bring them all to Palestine? They felt that this was a betrayal from the British. They felt that the British were going back on their earlier proposition to the Jews that they would help them establish a homeland in Palestine. So they were very upset with this. So the Haganah, which was the military arm of the Jews in Palestine, they actually arranged, independent from the British, without consulting the British, the Haganah, the Jewish military force in Palestine, they arranged for a ship of Jewish refugees from Europe that were fleeing from Hitler. They arranged for a ship of these refugees to come to Palestine. So this ship coming from Europe, full of Jews, it came into Palestinian waters near the coast of Palestine. But the British Navy, when they saw this ship, they said, we cannot allow this. We cannot allow these Jews to come into Palestine, because if they come into Palestine, this will make the Arabs mad. The Arabs will revolt, and we can't deal with the Arab revolt right now. So what did the British Navy do? This ship was already in Palestinian waters. So the British Navy escorted the ship to the Haifa port, one of the ports of Palestine. But they did not allow the passengers of that ship to disembark and go into Palestine. Rather, they arranged for another ship to be brought to the port, and then they transferred all of the passengers on this ship to the other ship that they arranged. And they said that this ship is going to depart immediately from the port. It's going to depart to Mauritius. And these Jews on this ship, they will be relocated in Mauritius. So the Haganah was very angry. Like, what are the British doing? They were very, very angry. So to show Britain, to teach the British a lesson, these Jewish military officers from the Haganah, they wanted to show Britain that they would not accept any other homeland for the Jews other than Palestine. So what did they do? This ship that the British arranged for these passengers to go to Mauritius in, the Haganah placed a bomb in that ship. Even though that ship was full of Jews, those passengers were Jews, their own people, right? But they placed a bomb in this ship and it exploded. And 267 Jews were killed. So the Haganah, they're Jews. And they killed their own people just to show the British that, look, we're not going to accept you sending Jews to any other land. The Jews, they will come here to Palestine. So look at the extent that they were willing to go to. They were willing to kill their own people just to make a point. Now around this same time period, Shaykh Amin al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and we have spoken about him before, he was one of the most respected, if not the most respected Palestinian leader. At this time he was in Lebanon, because after the Great Arab Revolt, the British forces, were out to get him. And he feared that if he was captured, he would be imprisoned, or maybe even worse, maybe he would be killed. So after the Great Arab Revolt, he fled Palestine and he settled in Lebanon. But then in Lebanon, he also had issues as well, right? Because in Lebanon there was a very large French influence on Lebanon, right? So because of that, he had to leave Lebanon as well, and he went to Iraq. And Iraq, at that time, it had an anti-British regime in charge of Iraq. But then that anti-British Iraqi regime, it fell. And the new government that came into Iraq, it was a pro-British government. It was a pro-British government. So then Shaykh Amin al-Husseini had to flee from Iraq as well, right? So eventually he went to Turkey. He stayed there for some time. And then from Turkey, he went to Germany in 1941. So Shaykh Amin al-Husseini, the great Palestinian leader, in 1941, he went to Germany. So when he arrived in Germany, he met personally with Adolf Hitler. Shaykh Amin al-Husseini, he met with Adolf Hitler, and they spoke about the Palestinian situation, and Hitler agreed that he would support the Palestinian revolution against the British. Not by sending his own soldiers, but basically he would provide some support, he would provide weaponry, and he would support the Palestinian cause. This is what Adolf Hitler told Shaykh Amin al-Husseini. So the Axis powers, Germany and Italy, which were fighting against the Allied forces, they were actually supporting the Palestinian revolution. Not by sending soldiers, but by helping with supplies and helping with weaponry and giving some under-the-table support. And the reason why they supported the Palestinian revolution was not because they had love for Palestinians or anything like that. No, they supported them under the concept that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That was it. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That was why they supported the Palestinians. So Shaykh Amin al-Husseini, he encouraged the Arabs that were living in Europe. And there were Arabs that were living in Germany. There were other Arabs who were living in Italy. There were Arabs who were living in these countries of the Axis powers, right? So Amin al-Husseini, he encouraged those Arabs to form an Arab army. Get together and form your own Arab army. And the Germans agreed to train that army. The Germans, even though they didn't send their own soldiers, they said, okay, we will train your people. If you guys gather your own army, then we will train them. So the Germans actually trained this Arab army. And this was in the year 1942. So there were hundreds of Arabs who were trained in this army to confront the Jews. And the Germans also supplied this army with weapons and money, with the goal of undermining the British presence in Palestine. Now the Jews, in the meantime, they felt very threatened by everything that was going on. What was going on in Europe with Hitler, what was going on in Palestine with the Arabs receiving this support from the Axis powers, right? The Jews felt very threatened by all of these movements, and they decided to hold a global conference in the United States to voice their concerns and their views. So they held this big conference in 1942 in Manhattan, in New York City. And there were Jews from America and Jews from around the world who attended this conference. It was held in the Biltmore Hotel in Manhattan. So it became known as the Biltmore Conference. And the conclusion that was reached at the end of this conference was that there is no solution for the Jews. Look what's happening to them in Europe. Look what Hitler is doing to the Jews. The conclusion that was drawn is that there is no solution for the Jews other than the establishment of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. They said that's the only solution. There's no second option. That's it. And both the Democratic Party in the United States and the Republican Party in the United States announced their full support for this Jewish cause. So this is something that had bipartisan support from the Republicans and the Democrats of that time. So now America got involved. And America strongly supported this this Jewish objective of establishing a homeland in Philistine. So America demanded from the British that they revoke their previous decision of not partitioning Philistine. Remember, one of the promises that the British made to the Palestinians to stop the revolt in 1939 was that they said, okay, look, we're not going to partition Palestine. Initially, before that, they had said we're going to partition it into two states, one state for the Jews and one state for the Arabs. But then when the Arabs were very upset with that and they didn't accept that, then the British, to quell the Arab revolt, they said, okay, we're not going to split the state. It's going to be one state, and that will be a state of the Arabs. Palestine will be one state and it will be ruled by the Arabs. They said that to quell the revolution. Now America is getting involved and they're demanding to the British that you must revoke your previous decision of not partitioning Philistine. And you must keep a part of Philistine for the establishment of a national homeland for the Jewish people. So under this American pressure, and Britain needed America on their side. This is in the midst of World War II. The British, they needed all the support they could get. They needed American support. They needed America during the war. So Britain agreed. They said, okay, whatever promises we made to the Arabs, we will cancel all of those promises. And then the British, they re-allowed unlimited Jewish immigration and unrestricted Jewish immigration into Philistine. Remember, they had told the Palestinians in 1939 that, okay, we're going to make a cutoff, that only a certain number of Jews can migrate into Philistine. But now they lifted all of those restrictions and they said unlimited numbers of Jews can come into Philistine and there is no limit on the numbers. So again, the British, they are breaking all of the promises that they made to the Arabs. So after this declaration by the British under American pressure, immigration of Jews surged into Philistine. Especially because there were so many Jews that were being displaced from Europe because of Hitler, right? So they had to find somewhere to go. So during this period, 92,000 Jews immigrated into Philistine. So Shaykh Amin al-Husseini, he saw that this is a big problem. So he demanded more German support. The Germans, he said to the Germans, you need to help us. Look what's happening. So the Germans, they sent weapons into Libya. And from Libya, those weapons were smuggled into Philistine. 30,000 pieces of weaponry from Germany were sent to Libya. And from Libya, they were taken to Philistine. Now, meanwhile, the Jews were also getting wary and they were getting upset with the British presence in Philistine. Even though the British, they had helped the Jews to reach this point in Philistine. Right? Without the British support, the Jews would not have even been able to enter Philistine in the first place. So the British, they really set everything up for the Jews. But now the Jews, now that they had gotten some of their own power, now they have big numbers, they have their own military, the Haganah, right? Now the Jews are thinking like, why do we even need the British anymore, right? So the Jews were getting tired of the British presence in Philistine, and they wanted their own independence. They didn't want to be living in Philistine under a British mandate. They wanted their own independence, and they wanted the British out, right? So the Jews in Philistine decided to take advantage of the situation, because during this period of time, Britain, they were under attack by the Germans, right? There was instability. So the Jews wanted to take advantage of this British instability at this time. And they thought that they could use that instability to force Britain to leave Philistine. And once Britain leaves Philistine, the Jews were ready to seize it, to take control of it independently from the British, right? By this time, the Jews had an army, just their army. The army of the Jews in Philistine was over 60,000 people. They had over 60,000 soldiers in their own army by now, right? So they didn't feel that they needed the British presence anymore. So the Jews started pressuring the British to leave Philistine. And how did they pressure the British to leave Philistine? The Jews started carrying out assassination operations against British officers. Imagine this, the Jews in Philistine assassinating British officers in Philistine, bombing British centers in Philistine, right? In an effort to force the British to leave Philistine to the Jews. So Britain was highly destabilized under these blows, right? They're facing strikes in Europe and in Britain itself, from the Axis, and now they're experiencing attacks from the Jews as well as attacks from the Palestinians in Philistine itself, right? So they're being bombarded from all angles. Now, the leader of the Jews, the leader of the Haganah, the leader of the Jewish paramilitary in Philistine was a man named Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion. And he made an announcement. He made a very bold announcement. He said that the Jewish state would not be established in Philistine alone, but the Jewish state will be established from the Euphrates River to the Nile River. From the Euphrates River in Iraq, all the way to the Nile River in Egypt. Ben Gurion said that this will be Israel. This will be the Jewish homeland. And they claim that they have support for that from the Torah, right? So Ben Gurion, he announced this publicly, and he called upon Jewish youth around the world to support this vision. So in May of 1944, the British Labour Party issued a decision to encourage Palestinians to leave Philistine. So now look, the British are encouraging Palestinians to leave Philistine, and they're offering them incentives to leave Philistine to make room for the Jews. So the British, they said, any Palestinian leaving Philistine, we will give them money, we'll give them this, we'll give them that, right? They're basically offering them incentives and offering them bribes, basically, to leave Philistine to make room for Jewish immigration. Now, during this same period of time, in the summer of 1944, there was a presidential election here in the United States in 1944. So in the summer of 1944, that's when the election was getting heated, right? The election would be in November, but during the summer, all the campaigning is going on, right? So the presidential candidates from both parties, Thomas Dewey and Franklin Roosevelt, they were the two candidates running against each other. But both of them called for supporting Jewish immigration into Philistine and establishing the Israeli state in Philistine. Both of them agreed on this. This was a matter of agreement between both of these presidential candidates in 1944. Also, in 1944, in the month of October, of 1944, for the first time ever, the Israeli flag was raised on Palestinian soil. At that time, of course, Israel was not a country yet. And that flag that they had, it was called the flag of the Jewish homeland. It was not called the Israeli flag because there was no Israel, right? But it was called the flag of the Jewish homeland, and they actually placed that flag on Palestinian soil. But the British, they were still trying to hold on to their mandate. They were still trying to hold on to Philistine. And the Jews, they still wanted the British out of Philistine. They really want the British to leave Philistine because they want to take over themselves. So late in 1944, the Jews, they assassinated the British Minister of State, the Baron Moyne, who was visiting Cairo. The Jews, they carried out an assassination in Cairo, right? So look at how far the Jewish hand has extended now, not only within Philistine, but now their reach is in other places as well. They actually arranged an assassination in Egypt of a British Minister of State, Baron Moyne, right? So this is how things escalated. And this is how badly the Jews wanted the British to leave Philistine, because they wanted to establish their state by themselves. In the year 1945, big things happened in 1945, the end of World War II. Germany and the Axis powers were defeated, right? And Germany fell to the hands of the Allies. The Palestinians had hoped, that Germany would win. The Palestinians were hoping that Germany would win because they felt that that would help them against the Jews and against the British. But the situation did not work out in the way that they had hoped. So in 1945, the leader of the Haganah, the Jewish leader Ben Gurion, he met with Jewish leaders in America. He came to America in 1945 and he met with Jewish leaders in America and he secured a contract from the American government to buy weapons, a weapons contract. So the Haganah would be purchasing weapons from the United States. So from that point, huge funds, massive American funds and weaponry began pouring in for the Jews in Palestine. And the US president at that time, Harry Truman, he called the Prime Minister Attlee of Britain to allow the entry of 100,000 more Jews into Palestine. Truman himself, he called the Prime Minister of the UK to tell him to allow 100,000 more Jews to come into Palestine, and the British, they agreed. The British, they agreed to do this, right? So now more Jews immigrated into Palestine. But the British, they were still holding on to the mandate. They were still holding on to power over Palestine. So the Haganah, the Haganah, the Jewish paramilitary arm in Palestine, the Haganah, they continued to increase their pressure on the British to leave. More assassination operations were carried out against the British. And the Irgun, we talked about the Irgun, which was an offshoot of the Haganah, a more extreme offshoot of the Haganah. They participated in these assassination operations against the British as well. The situation escalated to such an extent that the Jews struck the railways. They actually bombed the railways that the British used in order to disrupt British movement in Palestine. And in 1946, the Irgun, they bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. This was a big thing. They bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. This was done by the Irgun. They bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, and that is where the central offices of the British Mandate authorities in Palestine were located. That's where they worked out of, right? The King David Hotel. The central offices of the British Mandate were there. So the Irgun, they carried out they actually blew up a bomb, and they blew up the King David Hotel, and 91 people were killed in this attack. So this was a Jewish insurgency. It was a Jewish insurgency against the British. Now look at this. The British were the ones who facilitated from the beginning. They're the ones who facilitated the Jews to come into Palestine. Now that the Jews feel that they're strong enough to survive without British support, now they're killing the British in order to get them out. Look at this. The British, they were people of betrayal, but now they're getting a taste of their own medicine as well, right? So after this, after the bombing of the King David Hotel, the British, they started to rethink their presence in Palestine. They still held on to their position for the time being, but they started to become wary of staying in Palestine. Now, while all of this was going on, the Arab League, or the League of Arab Nations, they sent an official memorandum of objection against Jewish immigration. They sent this memorandum to the American government and to the British government. Basically a letter saying that we do not agree with you allowing so many Jews to come and migrate into Palestine. They wrote a letter of objection. That's it, right? This is what the Arab nations did. They sent a memorandum to raise an objection, right? And that was the extent of their support, the Arab nations. And Britain announced in response to this Arab memorandum its famous declaration that no, we do not accept your objection, and we will continue to allow unrestricted Jewish immigration into Palestine. And then it officially announced its abandonment of their earlier promise to the Palestinians. Remember, they had earlier promised to the Palestinians that they would allow the Palestinians to establish their own unified state. Now the British announced that no, we cancel that promise. And we will reinstate the Balfour Declaration. Remember the Balfour Declaration? The promise that the British would support a Jewish homeland in Palestine. They had announced that. Then they had rescinded it. They had said, no, we don't support this anymore. Now they're going back to it again. They reinstated the Balfour Declaration, and they reaffirmed their promise to establish a national home for the Jews in Palestine, right? And an Anglo-American committee was also formed to investigate. They like to form these committees, right? Okay, we're going to go and investigate, and we're going to make our report, right? It's all a bunch of games, right? So an Anglo-American committee was formed to investigate the issue of Palestine and propose appropriate solutions, right? So now the Palestinians, they're ready to revolt again. Like, look at this. We have been betrayed again and again and again. The Palestinians were ready to start revolting again, and they actually restarted the revolution. But this time it was very weak. The revolution was weak. And the Arab Higher Committee that was established by the Arab League of Nations, it was also weak as well. The Arab nations, they established an Arab Higher Committee that had representatives from the different Arab states, right? But this committee really didn't have much power and didn't have much influence as well. Then Shaikh Al-Hajj Amin Al-Husseini, he reappeared on the scene again, right? He escaped from the French following his arrest. He had been arrested, but he was able to escape, and he reappeared in Egypt. And the people in Palestine were very happy that, alhamdulillah, Shaykh Amin al-Husseini, he's okay. And when he came back to Palestine, there were celebrations and there were processions held in Palestine to mark the return of this respected man, Shaykh Amin al-Husseini. And the Arab League, they appointed him as the head of the Arab Higher Committee. So the Arab Higher Committee was basically a group of representatives from the different Arab states, right? And they appointed Shaykh Amin al-Husseini as the head of that committee. But Shaykh Amin al-Husseini, he faced issues with the other representatives of that committee. He faced issues with Iraq because he had to flee Iraq earlier. So he faced issues with the representative from Iraq. He had problems with Jordan because the chief of staff of Jordan at that time was a British officer, right? One of the main people in Jordan who was involved in decision making. The chief of staff was a British officer, right? Even though technically the ruler of Jordan was an Arab. The one who was actually calling the shots was a British officer. Also, Shaykh Amin al-Husseini, he had problems with Egypt due to the big British influence in Egypt, right? So this Arab Higher Committee, it had representatives from the different Arab nations, but still not everyone was on the same page. So Shaykh Amin al-Husseini, he had issues with the people on this committee as well. In the meanwhile, the Anglo-American committee that was supposed to investigate the situation of Palestine and come up with a solution, they issued their decision to, guess what? To allow even more Jewish immigration. Let more Jews come into Palestine. And they also announced that the Jews should have complete freedom to buy land. And Jews should have the right to own property and own land. So now immigration of Jews intensified even more. More Jews started immigrating into Palestine. During that period of time, 61,000 more Jews immigrated into Palestine. And the Arab countries, they responded to the British and they sent another memorandum demanding that the British arm the Palestinians. Can you believe this? They sent a letter to the British saying, okay, if you're allowing all of these Jews to come into Palestine, then you are responsible for arming the Palestinians so they can defend themselves against these Jews. They think that the British are going to give weapons to the Palestinians. So they wrote a letter requesting the British to provide the Palestinians with arms, with weapons. Look at this. What is this? Right? And the British, they responded again to this weak memorandum by saying, okay, we will refer the Palestinian issue to the United Nations, to the UN, right? Another joke of an institution, the UN. So now the British, they were finally ready to leave Palestine. They're saying, okay, this is enough. We have set everything up. Now it's time to leave Palestine. They really set everything up for the Jews. They basically laid out the red carpet for the Jews. And now they felt that, okay, now it's our time to leave. So the United Nations on July 3rd, 1947, they issued a recommendation to end the British mandate over Palestine and to divide Palestine into two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state. This is what the UN decided to do. That the British should leave Palestine, the British mandate should end, and Palestine should be divided into two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state. And as for Jerusalem, as for the city of Jerusalem specifically, it should be under international supervision. So it won't be part of the Jewish state, nor will it be part of the Arab state, but it will be basically it will be under international supervision. Now, of course, this decision, it had severe opposition from both the Jews and the Arabs. The Arabs, they did not want this. They did not want Palestine to be divided into two states. They wanted their Palestine to be their own state, their own independent state. They didn't want to give part of it to the Jews. The Jews were willing to accept a two-state solution, but they were not willing for Jerusalem to be excluded from their state. They wanted Jerusalem, right? So both sides, the Arab side and the Jewish side, they did not like this UN recommendation. They did not agree with this UN recommendation, right? And we'll talk more about the fallout from that, inshallah, in our next week's session, bi'idhnillah. Jazakumullah khair wa barakallahu feekum. Wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.